Do Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday pair well in terms of timeline and theological accuracy? Did Christ actually die on a Friday? Or was it a different day? Does it matter? Be sure to stick around until the end of the video to find out. But before I get started, there's something I just have to say real quick. More than 50% of those who view the content on this channel haven't taken that 1-second commitment of clicking the subscribe button yet. If that's you, just go for it. Now onto the video. This video presentation will be picking up where I left off in Do What in Remembrance of Jesus? So be sure to check that one out if you've yet to see it. In that video, I established a biblically backed timeline of events leading up to the Last Supper and into the Garden of Gethsemane. What we discovered was that the Last Supper that Christ participated in with his disciples before he was unlawfully judged and murdered was indeed a Passover meal, one of Yahweh's feast days. My hope with this video is to provide further clarity regarding the passages that deal with the chronology of Christ's crucifixion leading up to his resurrection. The highlighted points that you see on your screen are common objections for why some people have come to believe that the Last Supper wasn't a Passover meal and were covered in the aforementioned video. The remaining 2 points of contention which aren't highlighted will be addressed in this presentation. Usually when I see people demonstrating their timelines as visual aids, my eyes will crisscross from the overwhelming, hard-to-follow nature of what tends to get crammed into a single slide or infographic. Hopefully, I'm able to keep your head straight with my timeline graphics. Speaking of timeline graphics, I'll be making the main one used in this video available for my patrons to download over on my Patreon page. Having access to your own copies might make it easier to follow along for those of you who appreciate these types of visuals as a companion to your studies. It may serve you well to pause this video and go download the PDF as I take you through these events and their precise timing. Before I start delving into all the applicable passages of study, I would like to make a confession. I'm going to be referring to several pieces of commentary throughout this demonstration. Normally, I would frown upon this course of action because I typically recommend that people, especially new believers to the faith, just start reading and studying their Bible on their own initiative without the aid of commentaries, beginning with the book of Genesis and moving forward as you would normally read any other book. I recommend this because I think that commentaries, for the most part, have the counterproductive ability to throw people off of the scent of proper biblical understanding. However, every so often I do come across some biblical commentary that I've found to be useful and relatively pertinent to my studies. So, this presentation will be the exception to my rule. We all have our biases, whether we want to admit that or not, and I am biased to lend my proverbial ear to not only those who place their faith, hope, and trust in Yahweh as well as his Son, but to those who teach that all believers should walk in covenant with God by keeping the commandments as found in his law. When this truth is asserted in the commentary of a Bible translation, I'm willing to hear them out and to test what they have to say. That said, the commentary that I will be relying upon to provide much needed clarity in select passages is going to be out of the Aramaic English New Testament, the AENT. Produced by Andrew Gabriel Roth. Without getting into extensive detail, the AENT is an Aramaic to English New Testament translation that is derived from the Khaburis Codex, one of the 360 manuscripts that make up the Eastern Peshitta family. While I don't agree with all the commentary that is found in the AENT, I have come to appreciate several elements of information provided in it and believe their scholarly opinions are worth considering. After Yeshua ate the Passover meal and went to the Garden of Gethsemane, he was arrested by the officers of the temple guard and was then led to the Sanhedrin, where he was wrongfully mistreated by them. John 18:28 says, "Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover." The AENT translation says, "And they brought Yeshua from the presence of Caiaphas into the praetorium, And it was morning, and they did not enter into the praetorium, that they not be defiled before they had eaten the Pascha. This is where we start to encounter what appears to be a timeline discrepancy. If Jesus had eaten the Passover with his disciples hours earlier, then why did those who led Yeshua from Caiaphas' house to the praetorium worry about being disqualified from eating the Passover because of their entering the praetorium? Why would they be eating the Passover later that day if Passover was already celebrated the night that they had Yeshua arrested? First, let's look at the word praetorium. The praetorium was the Latin term to signify the commander's office or tent in a Roman base or encampment. This was Pontius Pilate's praetorium. In and of itself, there was nothing about the praetorium that could defile an in-covenant believer in Yahweh. It could, however, defile a man who holds a discriminatory tradition found within the customs of Judaism. Judaism has had a long-standing history of enforcing their own laws and customs, which, ironically, actually break the commandments of God. See Mark chapter 7 for an example of that. The religion of Judaism has had works that they compiled long ago, which are referred to as the Oral Torah. Among these works are writings called the Talmud and the Mishnah. AENT commentary on this John 18:28 passage says, as the Mishnah details in Pesachim 6 verse 4, a festal offering derives from the flock of the sheep or of the herd of oxen, from lambs or from goats, from males or from females, and it is eaten for 2 days and the intervening night, to the night of the 15th of Nisan. The second night's eating then of what is also called the shagigah, or obligatory burnt offering that the Pharisees must consume. This shagigah is the Pascha, that they are afraid they will not be able to eat if they are defiled. Otherwise, it seems that John's timeline is contradicting the synoptics and is a day behind. If the paschal lamb that is slaughtered on the 14th is meant here, this would certainly contradict the synoptic accounts that the Passover Seder had happened already when Yeshua was arrested, as opposed to here in John where the Pharisees are awaiting to do this next morning. According to the Mishnah, the Pharisees had a custom where they would consume 2 days' worth of animal sacrifices, meaning they would eat Passover on the evening of the 14th of the month, as well as the evening of the 15th of the month. They didn't want to get defiled by entering the praetorium, which is likely yet another one of their traditions, so that they could eat their second Passover meal that 15th night. This is a highly probable explanation for what John records in this chapter. Some scholars think that the following reason could also be the case. Quote, the Qumran manuscripts have shown the use of divergent calendars in heterodox Judaism, and it may thus appear that both dating traditions in the Gospels are correct, with Jesus using a Pharisaic date for the Passover, and John employing a Sadducean calendar for his Gospel. While I absolutely do agree that there were battles of conflicting calendars taking place in the first century, I don't think that John was pointing out a Sadducean calendar in his Gospel. I lean more towards it being a Pharisaic tradition, as I just read out of the quote from the Mishnah. For those of you who may be relatively new to this channel, I highly recommend checking out my video, A Heavenly Calendar, which explores what calendar ancient Israel adhered to, and how their captivity in Babylon was the catalyst that brought corrupted change to how they would keep time until this very day. Moving along in John chapter 18, Yeshua is led to Pilate the governor, and Pilate yells out to a crowd of Jews, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. As I clarified in Do What in Remembrance of Jesus, the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread were colloquially referred to as being one and the same feast. Pilate was not saying that his custom of releasing a prisoner to the Jews happened on the 14th of the first month, when the Passover lamb was eaten. He understood that the Jews had a festival called Unleavened Bread that ran for a 7-day period that was often just called Passover. The prophet Ezekiel shows how this was plainly understood even back in his day. Not only was this true in his day, but the context in which he speaks about the following passage is actually pointing to a time in the future when God's kingdom has come to the earth and the inhabitants of the kingdom are participating in the Passover, one of Yahweh's eternal festivals. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, ye shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. So, if Passover and unleavened bread are both synonymous monikers for a twofold feast, then what do we do with what John claims in the following text? Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." The AENT translation says, "And the evening of the Pascha had turned over, and then it was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Yehudins, Behold your king." Do you notice the nuances between these two versions of this passage? How could that morning be the day of preparation of the Passover, when the actual Passover had already been slaughtered and eaten the night before? What is this day of preparation verbiage all about? This brings us back to one of the common objections that I referred to earlier. People struggle with this term, and therefore the timing of the Last Supper Passover meal. And I completely understand that. It had created much confusion in my mind for yours as well. First, let's take a look at what the AENT commentary has to say regarding the mention of Passover in this text. Pascha, or Pesach in Hebrew, was and is frequently used interchangeably with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the first high day of the feast runs seamlessly after Pesach ends at sunset on the 14th. Exodus 12 shows that the actual emancipation of Israel from Egypt was after Yahweh killed the firstborn at midnight, so on the early hours of the 15th day. Mark 14:12-16 tells us that the Seder on the 14th of Abib, Passover evening, was the night before the crucifixion. Also, about the 6th hour refers to 6 a.m., or dawn, as synchronized to Matthew 27 verse 1. In John 4:6, Roman timekeeping system had two 12-hour cycles, one from midnight to noon, and the other from noon to midnight. The time here is now 6 hours after midnight. Now concerning the term day of preparation, which we will see come up elsewhere in this presentation, the AENT states that this very rare reading presents a number of challenges. He, John, is definitely speaking of the previous evening, when Pesach on the 14th turned over to the 15th. The arrest and trials during the night turned over into daybreak, as in all the other Gospels. The word chawat, which comes from the Aramaic, most of the time means was, so that is how it was rendered into the Greek. However, the other meaning of turn is rendered here, and it is in perfect past tense, flowing directly from erubata, evening, and into of Pesach. Otherwise, the reading would ascribe erubata to a daylight period. This plainly demonstrates an earlier Aramaic primacy over Greek, because it cannot work the other way into Aramaic. The Greek redactor simply asserted Hawat had its majority reading and infected all other Greek versions since. Subsequently, those churches, now divorced from their Semitic roots, uncritically accepted their translations of John, even when it was clear those readings contradicted the timing of the other three Gospels. What we're going to discover as we continue to wrestle with this day of preparation phrase is that the Greek translations of the New Testament manuscripts don't fully convey the Semitic meaning behind that which they were likely copied from. There are several scholars who believe that the New Testament writings were originally written in a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic, and then subsequently into Greek, as the Greco-Roman world would eventually become the largest disseminators of the New Testament writings in years to follow. I tend to agree with this. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the Greek language is an inferior language or that all other languages need to bow down before the Hebrew or its offshoots. My studies have shown to me that the writers of the New Testament likely penned things in their Semitic languages, and that, like all languages, sometimes when one translates from one tongue to the next, things could get lost or misconstrued in that process. I believe this is one of those circumstances. I'm going to continue tackling this translational day of preparation concept in this segment, and hopefully we can clear some of the terminology up. So, how does the day of preparation fit into this particular timeline of events? As you can see, Jesus was crucified during the daylight portion of the 15th, which would have been on our Wednesday. It was an annual high Sabbath day that started the evening before at sunset and would end at the following setting of the sun. John 19:31 says, "Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away." The AENT translation says, "And the Yehudins, because it was the setting of the day, said, These bodies should not remain on their stakes because the annual Shabbat is closing, for it was a high day, that they entreated Pilatus that they might break the legs of those who were nailed to the stake and take them down. AENT commentary on this passage asserts, most popular translations say preparation day, but this is not how John reads in the original Aramaic. The word arubata refers to the closing or setting of the day, derived from the Hebrew word ereb. It is only by assuming the execution day to be a Friday that one would also make the wrong assumption that afternoon was a preparation day, and this crept into early Christian imagination and interpretation of their texts. In other words, the Aramaic word erubata can only mean a closing or setting of the day. The idea of the preparation day creeping in through tradition will be further expounded upon in upcoming passages and commentary. After Yeshua gave up his spirit and his body was removed from off of the cross, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus took Yeshua's body and laid him in Joseph's tomb. Then in John 19:40-42, so they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. The ENT translation says, and they took the body of Yeshua and bound it in linen and with spices, as is the custom for the Yehudim when they bury. Now there was a garden in that place that Yeshua was executed in, and in that garden a new tomb that a man had not yet been laid in. And they placed Yeshua there because the annual Shabbat was turning over, and the tomb was near. Once again we see the AENT version saying something different. The first translation implies that the reason they had to get Jesus' body into the tomb with haste was because it was the day of preparation, and the weekly Sabbath was approaching, whereas the AENT says that the annual high Sabbath day was coming to an end. Those are two major differences. Let's look at the commentary. The word Eilah occurs once in the Aramaic New Testament. Another rare term here, chawat, is a usage that is unique to John's original writing style. The literal phrase is metil, because, the Shabbata, that Shabbat that was, Eilah, brought, entered, chawat, was turning. Traditionally speaking, Torah requires burial on the same day as execution, which overrode the requirement to rest on the Shabbat. The close proximity of Joseph's tomb reduced the work and allowed time to wash, change clothes, and be clean before sunset that day. Because the Sabbath that was brought was turning over. If the Aramaic version more accurately depicts the wording of the writers of these Gospels than the Greek does, then this necessitates that the Sabbath was in fact coming to an end, not that it was beginning. Moving into Luke's account, the Marys went to check on the body of Yeshua to see where it was that he was laid to rest. When they saw where he was placed, they returned back to Galilee and prepared spices and perfume that they were planning on applying to his body after the weekly Sabbath was over. Luke 22:54-56 says, it was preparation day, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was placed. Then they returned to prepare spices and perfumes, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. The AENT translation says, and the day was ending and the annual Shabbat was closing. And those women who came with him from Galilee were drawing near, and they saw the tomb and how his body had been placed. And they returned and prepared spices and perfume and rested on the weekly Shabbat, as was commanded. Quite a stark difference between these two passages as well, isn't there? Once again, one has the Sabbath beginning, whereas the other version has the Sabbath coming to a close. One says that it was preparation day, or the other simply says that the day was ending. AENT commentary on these passages states, the Aramaic word here, erubata, is derived from the Hebrew word ereb, and refers to a mixing of light and darkness, with specific reference to sunset or the sun declining into sunset shortly. Compendia Syriac by Payne Smith says of this word, to cause to set as the sun, metaphorically of souls caused to go down into sleep or death. Not only that, but erubata is listed directly as a derivative of reb, and the references cement its meaning as being applicable to the closing setting of many things. This same word then was mistranslated into Greek as epiphasko, which is an attempt to use imagery of light mixing with darkness, However, because epiphasko literally means growing light, confusion crept in that the text meant was about to begin or dawn. The same use of epiphasko applies in Matthew 28 verse 1. Clearly the Shabbat had ended by the time of the resurrection, but the Greek could be misconstrued to imply the opposite. Luke 23, 54-56 appears to be alluding to two separate Sabbaths in these passages. The first mention was the annual high Sabbath that starts on the 15th day of month 1, and the second mention of Sabbath was referring to the 7th day weekly Sabbath. Further commentary on verse 56 says, this refers to the weekly Shabbat from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, which is the only one tied to one of the 10 commandments, as in commandment number 4, remember the Shabbat day to keep it set apart. So, as you can see on the timeline, Yeshua was buried in Joseph's unused tomb around the evening time before the end of the annual high Sabbath day of the 15th. The chief priests and Pharisees wanted to make sure that Yeshua would stay buried in the tomb because they recalled a time when he had said that he would rise again after 3 days. Matthew 27, 62-63 says, the next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, we remember how that impostor said, while he was still alive, after 3 days I will arise. The AENT translation puts it, and on the next day, which was after the sun set, the chief priests and Pharisees were gathered with Pilatos, and they were saying to him, Our master, we've remembered that that deceiver would say while he was alive that, after 3 days, I will arise. Let's consult the AENT commentary once again. This is after sunset and not after the preparation. The word arubata is not used for preparation in Aramaic. In fact, the entire phrase day of preparation is lacking in the whole Aramaic New Testament. Please see Ephesians 6:15 where toyabai is used in the phrase with the preparation for the good news of peace. If it were the day of preparation, the phrase would be yomata de yatayaba, which is not in the text. Also too, the same word in Luke 22 verse 8 with the phrase zelo teoba lan peitzka, literally, go prepare for us the Pesach. It's no wonder that Passion Week has been such a highly contested timeline of events for scholars and believers alike for so long. It shouldn't strike us as odd that some concepts, idioms, words, etc. would be mistranslated, or that there would be additions or omissions, as the written words of the Holy Spirit-inspired men were copied and disseminated by other men over time. After all, we are dealing with human scribes and translators. Errors can and have happened. Does this mean we cannot trust the Word of God? Absolutely not. I'm thankful that we have the Word of God in many different languages. I'm thankful that we can study different versions of scriptures for the purpose of comparing and contrasting them. All of it is useful for sharpening us and improving our approach to apologetics. I'm going to take a little detour into one of Paul's epistles as I end this specific segment of the video. 1 Corinthians 5, 6-8. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, also was sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The AENT translation says, Your bragging is not praiseworthy. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole mass? Purge out from you the old leaven, that you may be a new mass, as you are unleavened. But our Pascha, Passover, is the Mashiach, who was slain for us. Therefore let us celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of wickedness and bitterness, but with the leaven of purity and sanctity. Both of these translations harmonize well, so I won't be honing in on any obscurities between the two. What I do want to highlight is that these Pauline passages are often used to support the idea that Christ had to have been crucified on the same day that the Passover lambs were slaughtered, because Paul calls Christ our Passover lamb. This harkens back to our last common objection regarding the Last Supper, and why some people don't believe the Last Supper was a Passover meal. The AENT commentary on the previous passages out of 1 Corinthians state that some suggest this verse 7 to be specific, means that Yeshua had to be killed on the 14th of Abib, or Nisan, at the time of the Passover lamb was killed for the evening sacrifice. However, that is contradictory with the Gospel accounts. The Last Supper was a Passover Seder, from late in the afternoon on the 14th to the early, dark hours of the 15th. As for the symmetry of the paschal sacrifice and the crucifixion, this too falls apart on close scrutiny. For the Passover lamb, its pain is fleeting as it is humanely and quickly dispatched with a single slit of the throat. How does this compare to 6 hours on a torture stake then? Unfortunately, many Christians have taken Paul's very distinctive form of communicating and run with his words in a direction that he had never intended for them to go. In this particular circumstance, folks have completely misunderstood that he was using figures of speech to draw truths about the Messiah. Paul was extremely familiar with the Levitical sacrificial system and had personally taught the congregations he was writing to about the law of God and how to keep it as part of being in covenant with their Creator. He often pulled ideas and instructions that are found in laws pertaining to priestly duties and made connections that were only ever supposed to be understood as such. Paul wasn't implying that Christ was a literal Passover lamb or that he was literally sacrificed. As the AENT commentator pointed out, how does the hasty slaughtering of a lamb compare to being nailed to a torture stake for 6 agonizing hours? The actual Passover lamb was then burnt and eaten after its death. Christ was not. So, because we were never meant to understand Christ's death on the cross in the same way that a lamb was sacrificed for the Passover meal, is it of extreme importance that Christ was to hang on the cross at the same time the lambs were being slaughtered? No. He can be likened to a lamb in a figurative sense without us having to suggest that he was a literal sacrifice who needed to be killed on the same day that the Passover lambs were slain. It has been my experience since coming into a deeper understanding of God's Word that people tend to build doctrines off of what sounds good or preaches well, even though it isn't scripturally accurate. Forcing Christ's crucifixion onto the same day that the Passover lambs were slain, while disregarding the fact that he celebrated the Passover the night before, is one of those unfortunate doctrines. Christ fulfilling the Passover, unleavened bread, and firstfruits during his first coming, and him fulfilling trumpets, atonement, and Sukkot at his second coming, is again one of those doctrines that attempts to squeeze things into an unscriptural alignment when the Bible doesn't even support that. Jesus himself said in Luke 22 that the Passover would be fulfilled in the kingdom of God, not that he was going to fulfill it just before his death on the cross. Perhaps this is content better expounded upon in a separate video. The math that's associated with the traditional Good Friday to Easter Sunday view just doesn't add up when you look at it. If Christ was crucified and died on a Friday afternoon and was resurrected just before that subsequent Sunday, then it only put him in the grave for 1 day and 2 nights. But what did Yeshua have to say about the length of his post-death experience? Matthew 12:39-40 says, "But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation eagerly seeks for a sign, and yet no sign will be given to it, but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." Jesus said that he would spend 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The heart of the earth is a reference to Sheol, which is a compartment in the underworld below. All the souls of dead men make their way to Sheol and remain there until their appointed release dates at either the first resurrection, which takes place on the day of the Lord, or the day of judgment at the end of the millennial reign. It's important for us to pay attention to the amount of time that Jesus said he would be occupying the heart of the earth. He said that his stay would be for 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." Setting aside the spiritual element that Christ was trying to teach in this passage, we can see that the day being referenced here is alluding to the time that the sun shines forth its light upon the earth. There is 12 hours of daylight, which means there is also 12 hours given to the nighttime. That totals a period of 24 hours, or 1 day. So when Yeshua asserted that he would be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, he meant for 3 12-hour periods of day and for 3 12-hour periods of night. That's 72 hours total in Sheol. Once again in Matthew, Yeshua informed his disciples, "And while they were gathering together in Galilee, Jesus said to them, The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. And they were deeply grieved. Jesus said that he would be raised on the third day. Again in Mark's Gospel, where he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise again 3 days later. 3 full days later. He never said partial days either. John recorded Yeshua speaking the following to the Pharisees in his Gospel. Jesus answered them, "Destroy this sanctuary, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Here we see Christ referring to his body as a sanctuary. Check out the teaching linked to the top of your screen to learn more about how we are to understand our bodies being referred to as temples. What's important in this text is that the religious elite that Christ was speaking to in John's account remembered that he had told them he would rise again, just as Matthew recorded it. And on the next day, which was after the sunset, the chief priests and the Pharisees were gathered with Pilatus, and they were saying to him, "Our master, we have remembered that deceiver would say while he was alive that, after 3 days, I will arise." Referring back to my timeline visual, as you can see, I have placed Yeshua in Sheol from around the time of the sunset on Wednesday, the 15th, until around the sunset of Saturday, the 18th. As soon as Yeshua said, "It is finished," and gave up his spirit, his soul would have descended from off of the cross and down into the heart of the earth, which is called Sheol in the Hebrew, or Hades in the Greek. But as all of us believers know, that's not where the story ends. Pay close attention to the timing of events in the following passages and track along with the timeline graphic that you downloaded earlier. John 20 verse 1 says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early, while it was still dark, and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb." Okay, so John informs us that Mary Magdalene gets up bright and early to go to the tomb where Jesus was buried, and it was on the first day of the week. Remember, the first day of the week, which is our Sunday, technically started the evening of the prior night, when Sabbath ended at sunset. She came when it was still dark outside. When she got there, she saw that the stone that covered the entrance into Jesus' tomb was rolled away. Luke records, "But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared." Luke adds a couple more details to this event. Not only was Mary Magdalene heading to the tomb on the first day of the week, but she was accompanied by others. They came with the spices that they had prepared to apply to Jesus' body. Mark not only tells us who went with Mary to the tomb, but felt the need to mention a couple of other specifics that John and Luke left out of their accounts. Mark 16:1-2 says, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb." Sabbath had passed. 2 Marys and 1 Salome came to Jesus' tomb bringing spices to anoint his body. It was very early in the morning on the first day of the week. The sun had just risen. John said it was still dark out, but it's still dark out when the sun first starts to rise, so there's no conflict there. Matthew records, "Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven, rolled away the stone, and sat on it." Again, Matthew tells us the Sabbath was over before the sun started to rise on the first day of the week. At this time, an earthquake takes place, and an angel comes and rolls the stone away. When the Romans who were guarding Jesus' tomb saw the angel, they quaked from fear of him and became like dead men. These guards then ran for their lives back to the city. Then, as Mark records, early on the first day of the week, after Jesus had risen, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had driven out 7 demons. None of the gospel accounts tell us the precise moment that Yeshua rose from the dead. However, what we do know is that he rose from the dead at some point before the sun had risen on the first day of the week. I've heard it said that Christ arose when the angels rolled the stone away from the tomb. That's conjecture. As we know, Christ didn't need anyone to roll the stone away to let him out. He resurrected into an immortal flesh and spirit body, one that could walk through walls and come and go as he pleased. kind of like the wind, as he told Nicodemus in John chapter 3. The stone being rolled away allowed for the followers of Christ to look into the tomb as proof that he was no longer there. If we take the words of Jesus seriously, which I recommend that we do, he would have resurrected nearing the end of the weekly Sabbath on the 18th day of the month. That falls in line with what he said about being in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. My hope and prayer is that this timeline teaching blesses you. Please leave your comments below if something was challenging to you, or if you'd like to just leave an encouraging word. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Until next time, keep hanging on his words.